Welcome to the Worldshapers, conversations with authors about their latest books. I'm your host, Edward Willett, and this episode's guest, Art Bell, talking about his new thriller, What She's Hiding. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Worldshapers, the podcast where I talk to authors about their latest books. My name is Edward Willett. I am myself an author of some, well, more than 60 books, both fiction and nonfiction. My most recent book was The Tangled Stars, a far future outer space space opera, I guess you'd call it, featuring an AI uplifted talking cat who becomes a starship captain. That came out from Daw Books in 2023. Yes, I think so. And that's my most recent novel. However, I do have a new one coming up, Fireboy, a young adult middle grade fantasy, will be coming out from my own Shadowpaw Press in July. And actually, the same day as the book we are talking about today, on March 25th, Shapers of Worlds Volume 5 releases, and that is an anthology of science fiction and fantasy by authors who were guests of this podcast during its 5th year. This will be the last of these anthologies. I've done 5. I counted them up the other day. There's 106 authors represented in these anthologies. Some of the biggest names in the field, people like Joe Haldeman, Sherilyn Kenyon, V.E. No, she wasn't in there. Sorry. John Scalzi is in there, though. I interviewed V.E. Schwab, but no, she's not one of the authors. Anyway, I highly recommend them, as obviously I would. It's called Shapers of Worlds Volume 5, and you will be able to find it everywhere that fine books are sold in paperback, ebook, and there's even a hardcover, although it's not distributed, but it is available in print-on-demand format if you go looking for it. So, Shapers of Worlds Volume 5 is coming up. Then my next book will be Fireboy. Both of those are published by my Shadowpaw Press. Shadowpaw Press is a small traditional publishing company right here in Regina, Saskatchewan, obviously, because that's where I am. I am Shadowpaw Press. There's also a cat, but he's just a figurehead, literally, because his picture's on every book. And he's the one that the company is named after, Shadowpaw. And it has a number of books coming up this year. Had a lot out last year. But my most recent releases are Hello and Theories of Everything. Hello is by Dave Carpenter, and Theories of Everything is by Dwayne Brenna. They're both Saskatoon authors. These are literary short fiction collections. And then coming up, I have, I mentioned Shapers of Worlds Volume 5. I think the next one after that is Cupboard Love, a dictionary of culinary curiosities. This is back in print for the first time in 20 years. A very, very funny, entertaining, and enlightening book about where the words that we use all the time related to cooking and culinary matters come from. That's by Mark Morton, who also wrote The Headmasters, a YA science fiction novel I published last year. The other ones coming up are a couple of reprints. There is The Night Girl by James Bove. That's a reprint. Young adult, well, new adult, I would call it. Urban fantasy set in Toronto. And then Waiting for the Piano Tuner to Die, which is another literary short fiction collection by Harriet Richards, whose novel The Lavender Child I reprinted just before Christmas. There's also a new science fiction novel by Ryan Melson called Gods of a New World. And that one, it involves billionaires, trillionaires, actually, richest people in the world, and AI, and how they are influencing the world of the very near future. So, might be a certain amount of resonance with current events. And then this fall, I have a new poetry collection by Glenn Sorstad, one of Canada's most popular poets, Order of Canada winner. It's called First Light, Last Light, and another short fiction collection by a Calgary author, Betty Jane Hegarat, and a reprint of my own novel, Magebane, which was published by Daw Books in 2011 under my pseudonym, Lee Arthur Chain. That's an epic fantasy with a certain amount of steampunkishness to it because there's an airship. So that's what's coming up from Shadowpaw Press. The Worldshapers will continue. If you have been watching, I was kind of hemming and hawing about what I was going to do, but I will continue to interview a variety of authors about their latest books. I was doing it weekly. That was part of the problem. That's too much for me with everything else going on. So it'll come out every 2 weeks. And I will continue to interview interesting authors. And I have several already working on right now, having them on. So looking forward to continuing to talk to people like today's guest, very fascinating guest, Art Bell. And let me tell you about him and about his new book. Art Bell is a writer and former television executive known for developing and launching the Comedy Channel, later Comedy Central, while at HBO, and as president of Court TV, overseeing daily live courtroom coverage and the production of hundreds of hours of original true crime television series, documentaries, and movies. His memoir, Constant Comedy: How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor, was a finalist in the 2020 Best Book Awards in both the memoir and business categories. Art has had short stories, nonfiction, and satire published in several journals, including Lowestoft Chronicle, Athlon, the Journal of Sports Literature, the Ocatello Review, Fiction Southeast, Cast About Arts and Literature, High Shelf Press, and Writers Read. And the novel we'll be talking about, his first novel, is a thriller. It's called What She's Hiding. Art lives with his wife, Carrie, in Park City, Utah. And let's talk to Art now. So, Art, welcome to the Worldshapers.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Edward.
Well, I'm, as I often point out to the listeners, this was science fiction and fantasy only for a very long time. And then last year I started broadening out into other genres, and largely because I have a publishing company, I wanted to be able to interview my own authors who weren't necessarily writing science fiction and fantasy. And somewhere along the way, publicists started to realize I had this website, and that's your publicist, I guess, reached out to me. And I said, hey, I've heard of him, and I'm also interested in the thriller genre, so I thought you'd be a great guest to have on.
Well, we're about to find out.
I guess so. Well, we'll start at the very beginning, as they say in Sound of Music, a very good place to start. Tell me about yourself. Where you born, grew up, and how you got interested in telling stories. And then there was that whole television thing in the middle there. So tell me about that.
That's right. How many careers have I had, actually? I was born on the Jersey Shore, Bruce Springsteen country. As a matter of fact, he was our local bar band when I was growing up, which was fun. And then I went to college near Philadelphia. Took a brief break from the small college I was going to go to University of Michigan because I was tired of small colleges. And then I went back. So I graduated from there. I was Swarthmore College, and my first job was as an economist in Washington, D.C.
What was your degree?
My degree was a BA in economics.
Oh.
And yeah, I know it's crazy that they made me an economist on day one. I was, I could just barely spell it at that point. And I was working with very, very smart people at a consulting firm. And man, I was so smart in those days. I look back and I think about what I did and how I did it and how amazing it was. It was really fun. But I left economics to go into the television business. And a lot of people asked why, including my parents, saying, what the heck are you going to do that for? And the reason was I always loved TV. I loved comedy. I loved storytelling. And I just did not think being an economics professor was going to suit me ultimately. So that's why I went into television. Got my first job at CBS, which was like working at the post office in those days. Giant company. I walked into my boss one day and said, nobody reads this report I work 5 days a month on. Can't we just skip it and do something useful? She said, absolutely not. So I knew that was not a place for me. So luckily, a friend of mine called me and said, why don't you come work at HBO? Now, in those days, and this was the early 80s, I realize I'm dating myself, but whatever.
I remember the early 80s, don't worry.
You were conscious then, huh?
Yeah, very, very. I was working as a newspaper reporter at the time. So.
Okay, there you go. HBO was like Netflix in those days. It was like the future of television. Everybody wanted to work there. And believe me, after CBS, that was a breath of fresh air. Now, I didn't tell you about my big dream. My big dream was I wanted to work at a comedy network. The problem was there was no comedy network. And I was so confounded by that. I mean, they just started CNN, the All News Network, and there was MTV, the All Music Network. And I'm like, where's the All Comedy Network? I love comedy. So I pitched the All Comedy Network several times to several people along the way, including the head of HBO, who told me it was the stupidest idea she'd ever heard, would never work. Undaunted, I went back to my office, wrote up a proposal, prepared to go give that to MTV and anybody else who would listen. When my boss came and said, hey, let's go see the chairman. This sounds like a good idea. Chairman bought the idea. and off we were inventing Comedy Central. I stayed there for 8 years. I went on to become president of Court TV. Now, Court TV is where I really got a big dose of the criminal justice system, as you can imagine. We started, when I got there, it was kind of a failing network, and all they were doing was showing, really just showing daytime courtroom coverage, which was not really making a lot of money for them. So what I did was I put in a schedule of essentially procedurals and forensic documentaries, which got an audience. And by doing those documentaries, I saw not only what was involved in criminal activity, but how to tell a story. And those were stories made of true crimes, basically. We did a couple of movies as well, which were fictional. So storytelling really kind of got built into me there in a big way, in a way that hadn't been, built into me previously.
Had you going way back? Well, two questions. Where did the love of comedy come from?
Oh, that's easy. When I was a kid, and I mean a kid, I was like 6 or 7 years old. I was watching the Ed Sullivan Show with my dad and brothers, and we were laughing at these comedians coming by. I mean, we had, I'm not sure how many of your audience members will relate to this, but, Richard Pryor did his first, one of his first TV appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I remember how funny he was. He was a kid. He was 19 years old or something. Alan King, the great, comedian whom I met years later at a lunch at the Russian Tea Room, which was one of the great moments of my life. One of the great things about working in television is you get to meet your heroes sometimes. And Alan King was one of the funniest guys I'd ever seen. And what impressed me about comedy as a kid was we were all laughing in front of the television set. The audience in the Ed Sullivan Show was laughing. And then I realized that 30% of the country was laughing at the same time. I mean, think about the power of comedy. And I got hooked. And then I studied it. I did a little sketch comedy along the way. Certainly some comedy and performance in college and in grad school. Amazingly enough, I did as well. So I really loved comedy. I thought it was cool. And
my second question was related to the storytelling. You say that's when Court TV is when you kind of really latched onto that. But most writers who eventually start writing fiction were storytellers from the very beginning. Do you think that gene was always there in you? Were you doing any writing at all?
Yes,
stories?
I was writing. I got very interested in writing in junior high school. I had one of those English teachers who changes your life.
Yeah, I had one of those.
Yeah, right. I think most writers have. And then in high school, I had a second English teacher who also was very influential and did a lot of, all kinds of writing, poetry, short stories, no novels, of course. I mean, who had the time, but, or the inclination, really. But I really found that I enjoyed writing, and it came in very handy in whatever job I ever had. I mean, the ability to report on what's going on. I mean, even if it's if it's a meeting or anything else. I mean, when people ask me, what's your advice to young people trying to get into anything today, business or whatever? I always say, well, there's two things. You have to be able to write. You have to be a good writer, and you have to be a good presenter. You have to be able to talk. It's amazing how many people kind of skip those two things as they go into business or whatever they're going into, and then find, well, wait a second, nobody's noticing what I'm doing or noticing me. So those are very important. So yes, along the way, I did a lot of writing. It wasn't until I won't say I did much writing at comedy because, I was surrounded by comedy professionals. Some of the funniest people on earth, but, I wasn't really part of that club, so I didn't do much writing there. But when I got to Court TV, it was really about shaping stories. And I not only learned how to do that, but I spent some time doing that. So that's why I said it nailed it. The other thing I will mention is that, you mentioned storytelling. I noticed that there are two kinds of people in the world. I mean, people who don't tell stories, they talk. But people like me and maybe you, I don't know you very well, but I assume, you're like, guess what just happened, or guess what happened yesterday, or that reminds me of the time I mean, that's storytelling. And I love telling stories. A lot of times they were funny stories. Sometimes they were sad stories. But whatever they were stories. And that's how I started writing memoir, which was my first real serious approach to writing after I finished with my experience at Court TV.
Because your first book is, of course, a memoir of your time at Comedy Central, right?
Yes, I had been telling the stories about Comedy Central for years after Comedy Central because there were so many of them. Not only meeting fascinating and funny people, but just the whole business aspect of it, trying to get something started against tremendous headwinds. I mean, nobody thought it would work. And when they did think it would work, it didn't work. The first year was a disaster. And, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because so many kids watching Comedy Central today, or certainly they know about Comedy Central, think it's been there forever. It hasn't
As for
been
them,
there. Sorry.
if they're 20, it has for them. So,
Well, that's right. So they figured, okay, it just showed up one day. And I wanted to make the point that no, it didn't just show up one day. It took a lot of people, a lot of hard work and perseverance to make it happen. I thought they were going to fire me every day I went to work for the first year. Fire me and close the thing down. That's just what it felt like. It was an oppressive experience. And I wanted to share that part of it, as well as the joy of starting something that I had always kind of been thinking about.
well, looking at the reviews of that book, people have, it says gripping as a thriller, or as gripping as a mystery story. And now here you are, you have switched over to the fiction side, and you have begun with a thriller. So, tell me how the book came about. You have it there. You can hold it up.
Yes, the book is What She's Hiding, a thriller. It's my first novel. And how did it come about? Well, before we get to that, I just want to commend you on noticing that the memoir was written on purpose as a page turner by me. I mean, and I didn't know much about writing page turners, but I realized that there were so many moments when you just didn't know what was going to happen next. And even though there was lives were not at stake, let me just put it that way, but reputations were, and careers were, and lots of stuff was. So, yeah,
The stakes were high.
The stakes, believe me, they seemed very high at the time. Looking back, okay, it's just about starting something that was going to end up making a lot of money and be kind of become a cultural thing. We didn't know that. We didn't. All the stakes were for me was like, okay, I have a job, I have a wife, I have a kid, I got to keep making money. What's going to happen here? I got to work hard on this, and I was employing a lot of people at that point. So we move on to why I wrote a thriller now. I really think it's because I read all kinds of genres. I won't say all of the genres. Romance, fantasy. Romantasy is just not something I'm going to dip my toe in anytime soon, I don't think. But, certainly science fiction. I loved science fiction as a kid.
Yay.
And I've continued to read. Yeah, yay. No, I really did. But also as a high school student, I discovered noir. The classic noir, Dash Hammett, James M. Cain. And I had always been fascinated by what they did and how they did it, how they wove a mystery or a thriller and how they made it all fit together or sometimes not fit together. So one of the things that I noticed is that sometimes not all the questions in these noir mysteries or noir thrillers got answered. Like the famous one is Chandler's The Big Sleep. He didn't say who killed the chauffeur. He just never said it. And he was called on it once by one of the directors making the movie. And he said, I have no idea who killed the chauffeur. And I thought that was very interesting. And I continued my love of noir and mysteries and thrillers throughout most of my life. When I got to Court TV, I mean, that was, again, I was steeped in the criminal justice system. I met a lot of people who were experts on the criminal justice system. I mean, forensic experts, I mentioned forensics, scientists, psychologists who were studying why people did bad things. I mean, I really had a good education there. Plus, I knew a lot of lawyers. All the lawyers who didn't want to be lawyers showed up at my door saying, put me on television. So sometimes I did. Anyway, yeah, so that was how I kind of gravitated to that whole crime thriller thing. But there was, for this book especially, there was a particular interest I had in violence. When I was younger, I read an essay by Harry Crews, which he was an essay writer. He wrote for Esquire and Playboy and magazines like that. And he wrote an essay which later became famous. I think it was actually published as a book with some other of his essays. And the essay was called "The Violence That Finds You." And it was about how he got into a bar fight and he couldn't get out of it. He couldn't back away. He couldn't call it off. This guy wanted to fight. He wasn't grown up at this point. He was an adult. And he had to fight. And he talked about the fact that sometimes you get into violent situations, even if you're not a violent person. And he really explored the psychology of that and the sociology of that and everything else. And I was really taken by that because I guess a lot of us, or some of us, face violent situations and they're scary and you have to deal with them sometimes. So what I did is I sat down. I actually thought I was going to write this as a short story. I sat down and wrote an introduction about a guy who was a lawyer, just an average lawyer in New York City at a big law firm. And his ex-wife shows up at his office and basically says, look, if you don't help me, I need to get a lot of money by next week or they're going to kill me. And they said they'd kill you too. Okay, so that's a setup. And it sounds pretty extreme. And it sounded pretty extreme to the lawyer who said, don't be ridiculous. That's the stupidest story I've ever heard. But he goes home that night and his apartment's been tossed and he gets a threatening phone call. And he realizes maybe she was telling the truth. And he goes back to find her and she's disappeared. And that's what kicks us all into motion. Ultimately, he has to face some real danger, some real mortal violence, danger of the type he'd never been exposed to. And the question was, how was he going to handle it? And the answer, I didn't know. As I wrote the thing and it kept going and I realized it wasn't a short story anymore, it was heading towards novel. I just wanted to see what happened. And that's how I wrote it.
Well, that's kind of this podcast for the first 5 years was entirely focused on process and how writers go about creating their that's why it's called the Worldshapers, how writers go about shaping the worlds of their stories. And it sounds like you would, at least on this novel, you would definitely fall onto what's known as the pantsing side of things, as opposed to the plotting side of things, where you did not have an outline that you were working to. You were just finding out what happened as you wrote.
Absolutely. And, as I was doing it, we hadn't, I didn't know too much about process at the time, especially the pantsers versus plotters thing. I was amazed to find out how many writers I admired and loved who were pantsers, who wrote novels, by starting with a premise and a character and writing to see what happened. And I just thought, okay, so I'm not crazy after all.
Well, one of the great things about doing this has been discovering that, there is no one way to write a book. So just two examples, Kendari Blake, who's a very well-known YA writer, started the book that I interviewed her about with a single sentence and went from there. And then Peter V. Brett, who wrote a big fantasy epic, had a 150-page outline before he actually started writing the book, and then he just filled it in as he went along. So those are kind of the extremes, and we all fall somewhere on that spectrum. I write a synopsis that I then ignore. I think that's how it works for me. So it is interesting that everybody does it a little bit differently.
You left out one version of process that I discovered recently. Some writer actually writes the book as a short story, 7 to 10 pages. Then he redoes it and it's 25 pages. Then he redoes it and it's 45 pages. And, ultimately he gets to 300 plus pages. And I thought, well, that's kind of crazy. but I don't know if I could do that.
Lots of authors have turned short stories into novels, but not quite that way. Usually, it's you take the novel, and the short story turns out to be a scene in the novel, and then you build the novel around it. I've done that myself.
True. Chandler actually combined his short stories to make novels, which is one
Yeah,
of the reasons he ended up in such a mess sometimes.
there's a word for that. I can't remember what it is, but there's a term for it.
Really?
Um, so, what was your actual? Well, let me back up a little bit. You had also written some short stories, right? And had some short stories published
Yes.
before you launched into
Yes.
this. So you did at
Yes.
least have that experience of writing fiction.
Yes. Yes. I had written fiction by that point, and I found that I loved writing fiction. Writing memoir, and I wrote a lot of memoir. That's how I got into writing, uh, because I took a class or a couple of classes at the Sarah Lawrence Writing Institute in New York. It's not in New York; it's outside of New York, but with some very, very impressive teachers. And it turns out that memoir was a good place to start writing because, of course, the story is there to some extent. And as I said, I've been telling stories about my life since I was a kid. I thought it was so much fun. So it was easy to get into writing. I will say this: it is amazing how much teachers or people who know what they're doing have to offer when you don't know what you're doing.
Mm.
I think I walked into class thinking, okay, I can write. I'm a pretty good writer, right? Just how much I learned about how to shape a short piece, what memoir was about. The whole idea of memoir. I learned so much, and then I did take a short story writing class during which I wrote no short stories, but I did do some writing. And then I wrote some short stories, and none of them were thrillers. I mean, they were more kind of. My favorite was actually a story of a guy who meets a woman in the waiting room of a psychiatrist's office, and they kind of meet cute, and she's a little daffy, and he's a little scared, and just what the relationship turns into after 15 pages, and that's my favorite. But so I actually wrote some science fiction, which you would probably laugh at and just see if you can make 2 points in your garbage can with, because
I'm
it
way
did.
too nice for that.
I actually like the story, but it was really kind of ham-handed. Anyway, yes, I've written fiction, and I've enjoyed writing
I've
fiction.
done a lot of. I've been a writer in residence twice at libraries here in Saskatchewan, and so I've worked with all levels of authors, and I'm very nice.
Oh, well,
Maybe too nice sometimes. I don't know.
that's good to know. Be
When you
careful. Be careful. I might send you that short story for your
when you were
comments.
writing the novel, what did like? Were you working on it every day? Was it something that you plugged away at conscientiously? And how long did it take?
It took a couple of years. The conscientious part is an interesting question. Unfortunately, I've noticed in my life and in most of my work, I have two modes, which is either incredibly lazy, I don't really feel like doing anything, and just crazy bursts of energy and creativity,
Sounds
which
familiar.
last for, sorry,
Sounds familiar.
is that you too?
A little
I,
bit, yeah.
it's not everybody. I mean, some people can just kind of plug away. I ran into Walter Mosley like a year ago, and had a short conversation with him. But anyway, then I did see him speak, and he writes 3 hours a day, come hell or
Mm.
high water. 3 hours a day. I did not do that. But what I did do was get obsessed with the whole thing. I mean, I'd wake up at 3 a.m. saying, I figured out how to get out of that mess and go down and write something.
You're
And
actually writing when you're not writing is something that people
that
learn
is,
as writers as
yes,
well.
yes, that is an excellent point. That is an excellent point. You're writing all the time. You're really thinking about your story. If you're in the middle of a story, especially, you're thinking about it all the time. And one problem pantsers have with thrillers, and I don't know if you can actually pants your way through a mystery because there's too much to plan, but is you do write yourself into corners once in a while, like, okay, now what? So you have to find out if someone's going to walk in, a new character, or somebody's going to walk out, die, So you really have to think about that stuff.
Yeah, it's actually what I'm working on now. I have a synopsis, but I kind of didn't look at it, and I was pantsing, and then I realized this is not going where I think it needs to go, and I'm actually going to have to back up and take another run at that section for that very reason. So, yep, familiar with that too.
I
So
was
once you
lucky. I was lucky, though. I have to say, I didn't do huge rewrites of
that was my next
previous stuff.
question.
Well, no. I mean, I did editing. There was but I didn't end up in a situation like yours where I said, "Oh man, this is just not working." I rewrite the 30 pages of it to kind of make it fit. And I think that was just dumb luck. I think it could have happened that way.
When you got to the end, there would have been considerable revision. What did that look like for you? A lot of people have better beta readers who will read stuff over and provide suggestions. Is that how it worked for you, or did you go it alone?
I have had a writing group for many, many years now. It's pretty much the same writing group. It was started by a professor I met at Sarah Lawrence, who just kind of said, "Hey, I'm going to grab about 5 or 6 people and start this writing group. Are you interested?" And I've stuck with it, and that kept me going. And believe me, these people, they are. It's a group of not only good writers but good critics. I mean, they are very good at saying that's not working, or I don't understand that. I don't understand that is my favorite criticism. I don't understand what's going on, because then you've blown it. I mean, if people can't make sense of a scene, then you've blown it. And sometimes that would happen. So that was encouragement. I also had my novel edited by the same editor who edited. She was a professional editor, had worked in many publishing houses, and it's terrific. And she edited my memoir as well. So I went back to her for my novel. She loved my memoir. I can't say she had the same reaction with my thriller. And I think it's because she wasn't like a big thriller fan, but she did come around to liking my novel a lot, especially when I made some of the changes she suggested, which were excellent. I mean, really, she good editors. You think about editors a lot, and sometimes it's really kind of a dance between the writer and the editor for long periods of time. This was more of a, here's my manuscript, what do you think? And she said, okay, here's what you need to do. And I did about 85% of that. So
Then presumably there was another editor when you sold it to Ulysses.
yes, actually, that was an interesting process because I didn't expect to sell it to Ulysses. Ulysses had published my memoir, and they were mostly doing fiction, nonfiction rather. So I said to the publisher, who had worked at Hachette for a long time before he ended up being the publisher at Ulysses, know anybody who'd be interested in this? And he came back 3 weeks later. He said, yes, we love it. We'd like to publish it. And I said, wow, that's great. You just saved me 6 months of trying to find a publisher. But one of the things he said was, it doesn't look like it needs a whole lot of additional editing, which turned out not to be true in the copy editing sense. But it did turn out to be true in the there were no big changes really to the content, characters. A couple of scenes they pointed out some flaws that I pasted back together, just sort of to make it more realistic, where I hadn't done enough of my homework to find out how things happened. But for the most part, by the time I got it to Ulysses, it was pretty much done.
Well, the book comes out on the 25th, which, when this goes live, will be 2 days away, on Tuesday, the 25th of March. You've had some preview reviews, I guess you'd call them,
Yes.
and they seem to be very positive. Do you read reviews, and are you pleased to see those?
Yes. How could I not be pleased to see good reviews? I mean, the person I'm working with at my publisher, who's terrific and has been a big supporter of the book, I asked him once along the way, before we got too far into it, like, is this book any good? And he said, yes, it's a good book. And I will tell you that every 20 minutes, because writers have to be reassured that it's a good book every 20 minutes.
I remember talking to my editor at DAW, Sheila Gilbert, once, and we'd gone through all this stuff. I don't understand this, and this needs to be expanded. And I said, finally got to the end. I said something like that: "Is this do you like the book? You said, well, of course I like the book, or I wouldn't be publishing it. So, but it's
But
still that little bit of, yes, it's a good book is very, very
you
important
you,
to hear.
you just want to keep hearing that every
Yeah.
20 minutes. And unfortunately that job falls to my wife often. whose eyes tend to glaze over after we talk about it for 3 minutes at this point. But she's been great. She's my first and best reader and editor, and she's very good. And I take her advice seriously. But anyway, yes, I like positive reinforcement. And you know what I don't like? Negative reinforcement.
Funny that.
You get somebody who writes a bad review, because they didn't like it, didn't get it, whatever. And it just, it you start questioning all the good reviews. I don't know how else
read
put
like a 3-star review. There's often something useful in there for the next book. I don't submit myself to the 1-star reviews. I might read the first sentence, and I'll tell you, I've told this before. I wrote a fantasy trilogy that started with a book called Masks under one of my pseudonyms, E.C. Blake, and somebody on Goodreads who likes to trash books found it, and she has followers, so it's the top review on Goodreads, and the first sentence of the review is, "This is not so much high fantasy as it is toilet paper." I did not read that review.
You just have to scratch your head about that whole situation. I mean, look, I read books I don't like. Sometimes I stop reading in the middle. I would never say, I mean, unless it was written at a, kindergarten level or something, I wouldn't trash the book to somebody else in a public forum like that.
There is unfortunately a group of reviewers that's what they like to do, and they're on Goodreads, so that does happen sometimes. So it hasn't affected the book. It's still my best-selling book, but it was.
So there's hope for all of us, huh?
So yes, it comes out on March 25th. What do you hope reader reaction will be to it? What do you hope readers will find in this book?
Well, there's a couple of things I'm really proud of about the book, maybe 3. Putting the fact that I think it's it's an interesting, gripping story. But the one thing I found out about noir, or I came to learn about or understand about noir, is so much of noir, even the classic noir, they're love stories. I mean, it's about a guy, a hero, in love with a woman who's sometimes not such a good person. And I built that in a modern way. I think there's actually 3 women in this story. His ex-wife, whom he still carries a torch for. Henry is the character's name. And then Henry kind of falls for somebody else during the story, who has not much to do with, solving his problem, but ends up helping. And the third person is Gabriella. She's a detective, and she turns out, I mean, everybody reads the book and says, man, Gabriella, she's great. And she is great. And there's no, it's not clear if there's any attraction between them, at least in this book. Maybe there is, but she is such a strong, good, fascinating. I mean, she's kind of like the equivalent of the classic noir hero, but she's a woman, and that wasn't written so much in the same way. And she's somebody who wandered into the book a quarter of the way through, and I said, hey, wow, she's great. And she turned out to be great. So I'm really proud of that. Second thing is, and this kind of goes into your world building concept that, sci-fi and fantasy writers are so proud of. But world building is something I did too in New York City. I mean, it takes place in New York City, but you had to make the city part of the story, and you had to build it the way you wanted the characters to experience it. It's not just, people walk into New York City and they're in Times Square and they see the lights and it's all a lot of fun. But I had to make this a noirish, kind of threatening, hot and hazy, uncomfortable New York City. And I think I've been told that it worked very well, that it's a really interesting depiction of New York City, and New York City becomes a character in the book. And I really think that's a good thing.
And you lived in New York City?
I did live in New York City for 15 years.
Yeah.
And loved the city.
You'd mentioned when you were talking about the character, you said at least in this book, does that mean you were working on a sequel?
Yes, interestingly, I ended the book such that there could be a sequel, meaning I didn't kill off all the characters, which would have
Didn't go
been
all Shakespeare on them, so
yeah, right. But I wasn't sure that I would work on a sequel. The publisher is very interested in me working. Yeah, he basically said, "Please write the next one because we love the characters." And then, actually, two reviewers mentioned it. Like, I hope this is first in a series because the characters are interesting. So, I've been given a lot of, not a lot, some permission to write the next one, and certainly have hoped to do that. I've started it, honestly.
is there anything else you're working on?
Well, I just wrote like a 50-page young adult thing, and it was based on an experience in my life. Again, I guess I'm wandering around genres, and I like it. And now the question is, am I going to do what that other guy did and make it 100 pages and then make it 200 pages? I don't know. We'll see.
Well, one thing about YA books is, although there are plenty of really big fat ones, you can actually make a smaller one.
I know. I'm excited about that. So we'll see. We'll see if I actually continue working on that. It's hard to work on two things at one time, though, I found.
And where can people find you online?
Art Bell Writer is my website where you can find out about the book and about me. And there's actually a discussion guide for book clubs. And I will mention that I love doing book clubs. Even, I did a lot of book clubs with my memoir, and I hope to do a lot of book clubs. I'm getting a lot of interest, actually. I hope to do a lot of book clubs with this. So either I'll come to wherever you are, or I'll certainly be able to get on Zoom and attend in that way. But I hope this is a good book club book.
And you have resources for book clubs on the website?
As I did I not mention that? Yeah, there's a discussion
but I was
guide.
wondering what they were.
There's a discussion guide, yes, on the website. There's also Q&A with me in the same place, and the publisher will put the discussion guide in the paperback version.
And there's a paperback version coming. There, see, I just learned something else.
Well, we have the highest hopes. I mean,
well, Art, thanks so much for being on the Worldshapers, and it was a fascinating conversation. And best of luck with the book. As I said, it'll come out. This should go live on the 23rd, and it comes out on the 25th. So,
yes, I'm very excited. Thank you very much for having me.
Available everywhere.
Certainly available everywhere. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks so much to Art for that great conversation. I really enjoyed talking to him, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. That's it for another episode of The Worldshapers. I will be back every 2 weeks, as I said. That's the current plan anyway. Just give a few details about where you can find The Worldshapers and me online. The Worldshapers is on its own website at theworldshapers.com, where you will find a bit of more information about each book in textual form and, copy of the cover and all that, and links to the audio only version, which you may be listening to, of course. However, you may be watching it on YouTube. If you go to X, you can find the Worldshapers there at the Worldshapers, and you can find it on Facebook at the Worldshapers. You can find me at edwardwillett.com. That's my name with .com on the end. You can find me on Twitter at ewillett, on Instagram at edwardwillettauthor, on Facebook at edward.willett, and other places. And you can also find me on YouTube, as you may very well have if you're watching this. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/edwardwillett. And one of the things you can find on here, besides me talking to authors, is me walking around my home city of Regina, Saskatchewan, and blathering as I walk. It's called Walking in Regina. It's a whole playlist. Goes back, about 3 years now. I've been a little slower on the walking the last couple of weeks because it's very, very icy here as the snow starts to melt, and then we get more snow, and it's this freeze-thaw cycle. And I did have a fall earlier, so I'm being very cautious. But especially as the weather starts to improve, I expect I will once more be venturing further afield in the city and continue. But I am walking a little bit, so please check that out. And if you enjoy listening to me blather, that's a good place to hear it. And you can also find Shadowpaw Press, which I've mentioned, online at shadowpawpress.com. You can find it on X at Shadowpaw Press, on Facebook at Shadowpaw Press and on Instagram at Shadowpaw Press, because that one I got the same handle for everything. Okay, that's it. Like I said, blathering. That's enough of it. Thanks for joining me on this episode of The Worldshapers, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks talking to another author about their latest work. Bye for now.